For 11 days a Russian drone watched the same Ukrainian truck cross the same dirt road at the exact same hour, and not once did the operator pull the trigger, because everything he saw on his screen told him the real target was still coming. But on the 12th morning, when the order finally came through and the missile left the rail, he had no idea that the truck below him had never carried what he thought it carried. And the moment that warhead made contact, every assumption Russian intelligence had built over those 11 days collapsed in a single second. The first observation began on a Tuesday morning in late October of 2023, somewhere above the gray fields east of the Dnipro River. A Russian Orlan-class reconnaissance drone, operated from a small command trailer near a base in occupied southern Crimea, picked up the heat signature of a single Ukrainian truck rolling along an unpaved farm road. The operator, a 29-year-old lieutenant the unit called Mikhail, marked the contact in his log and moved on. By itself, one truck on one road meant almost nothing. The front line saw thousands of vehicles every week, civilian and military mixed together in a slow river of dust, diesel smoke, and rolling noise. But the next morning, at exactly 6:14, the same truck appeared at the same kilometer marker, traveling in the same direction, at the same speed. Mikhail noted it again on the third morning, when the same truck crossed the same patch of road at the same hour for the third time in a row. His supervisor leaned over his shoulder, watched the screen for almost a minute without saying a word, and then quietly delivered the instruction that would shape the next 11 days. He told Mikhail to keep watching and to say nothing about it on open channels. In Russian intelligence work, repetition without explanation is treated as one of the most reliable signals of something hidden. A truck that runs the exact same road at the exact same hour is almost never a farm vehicle. It is, according to internal Russian doctrine, adapted from older Soviet manuals, studied for decades inside military academies, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, almost always part of a logistics pattern. And the road that the truck used was not just any road. It led, after a series of turns through abandoned fields and a half-burned tree line, toward a small cluster of warehouses that Russian analysts had been trying to confirm as a possible Ukrainian munitions transfer point for nearly 4 months. The truck, in their eyes, had become the missing piece of a puzzle they had been quietly assembling. From that point on, the watch became continuous. Drones rotated overhead in 12-hour shifts. The signal was passed up through the chain of command, then up again, until it reached desks that rarely concerned themselves with single vehicle observations. The truck was given a tracking designation, a code name short enough to fit on a paper log, and the road was placed under priority observation, alongside several active artillery zones. Inside the cabin of the truck, however, sat a man named Yuriy. He was 46 years old, born in a village near Crimea, with 2 grown daughters and a wife who worked as a school nurse in the same town where he had been raised. For most of his life he had driven the same kind of Soviet-era cargo vehicle for a state-owned grain cooperative, the same dented blue cab and patched canvas covering he had known since his late 20s. After the full-scale war began in February of 2022, he had been quietly approached by a unit of Ukrainian military intelligence that did not introduce itself by name and was offered a job he was told he could refuse without consequence. He chose not to refuse the job, as it was explained to him in the back room of a small repair garage just outside Mikhail, was deliberately ordinary. He was to drive his truck along a specific route on a specific schedule every single day, regardless of weather, regardless of fatigue, regardless of what he heard on the radio. He was not to vary the time, not to vary the speed, not to vary the load. Inside the cargo bed were sealed crates that, according to Ukrainian sources later cited in international defense analyses, contained nothing more than agricultural fertilizer wrapped in industrial plastic and a layer of old burlap. Yuriy was not told why. He was not told who would be watching. He was simply told that the route mattered, and that the consistency mattered more than the cargo itself. He was paid in cash, weekly, and asked never to speak of the arrangement, even at home. By the 7th day, the Russian command in Crimea was almost fully convinced. Analysts in the operations room compared satellite imagery, radio intercepts, and drone footage stitched together over the previous week. They built a profile of the truck, the road, and the warehouses that sat at the end of it. According to reports later attributed to defectors and open-source intelligence groups, Internal briefings inside the Russian command described the route as a probable evening resupply line for short-range Ukrainian artillery operating in the wider sector. A targeting package was assembled, complete with weather projections, alternative impact angles, and a list of secondary observation assets, ready to confirm the strike from multiple directions. But before the order could be approved, a senior Russian officer, said by some sources to be a colonel from the Missile Coordination Center, requested one more day of observation. He wanted to see if a second truck would join the pattern. He wanted, in his own words, the entire chain visible before he allowed the trigger to be pulled. The second truck never came, but during those extra days, something else did. Russian electronic warfare operators, eager to confirm their analysis and unwilling to let a target of this perceived size pass without verification, began transmitting low-power radar pulses toward the warehouses to test for emissions in return. They began monitoring radio traffic on frequencies they believed Ukrainian artillery units used during evening coordination windows. They activated long-range sensors that normally stayed quiet for security reasons, brought additional drones into the rotation, requested updated satellite passes, and turned on coordination systems they normally kept silent for weeks at a time. And every one of those signals, every transmission, every emission, every brief electronic whisper, was being patiently logged by a Ukrainian electronic intelligence team, operating from a quiet building in the Mikhail region with windows that had been taped over since the previous winter. The truck, the road, the warehouses, and the daily 614 crossing had never been the operation itself. The truck was the bait. The Russian observers were the target. On the 12th morning, when Russian command finally approved the strike, the missile left the rail at 6:22 in the morning. The warhead found the truck near the same kilometer marker, where it had been recorded for nearly 2 weeks. Yuriy, according to Ukrainian sources cited in later interviews with international correspondents, had quietly stopped driving the route on the 11th evening, and had been replaced for the final morning by a remotely operated decoy version of the same vehicle, with the cabin sealed, and the steering controlled by a small unit hidden in a tree line nearly a kilometer to the south. No civilian, on either side of the conflict, was reported lost in the strike. But the moment the warhead made contact, the value of the operation flipped. The Russian unit had revealed almost every piece of equipment it had used in its observation, every frequency, every emission pattern, every drone rotation cycle, every coordination call. Within 72 hours, according to Ukrainian sources later quoted in Western military reviews, multiple Russian electronic warfare positions in the area were located, mapped, and placed under surveillance themselves. Some of them, in the weeks that followed, were reportedly silenced one by one in a series of quiet operations that drew very little public attention at the time. For the operator named Mikhail, none of this was visible to him. He sat in the same trailer the next morning, drinking the same coffee from the same dented metal cup, looking calmly at the same screens. He believed, as his briefing told him, that he had taken part in a successful strike against a confirmed Ukrainian logistics target somewhere along an unimportant farm road. It would be many months before the wider picture would surface in international defense analyses, and even then, many of the details would remain disputed, contested, and quietly studied behind closed doors in capitals far from where the truck had ever driven. What this case showed, in the eyes of analysts who studied it later in considerable detail, was a quiet shift in the way the war was being fought. The most valuable target had not been the truck on the road, it had been the certainty of the people watching it. For 11 days, an entire intelligence chain had built its confidence on a single repeating image. And in the end, that confidence itself became the weakness. In modern conflict, observation is no longer a passive act, it is a transaction. And every long look across a screen, eventually, leaves a trace behind it. If this story made you think differently about how modern wars are actually fought, far from the front lines, and deep inside the screens of those who believe they are watching, take a moment to subscribe and turn on the bell. Every week we explore operations like this one, where patience matters more than firepower, and where the smallest detail can rewrite the outcome of an entire campaign. Leave a comment with the operation you would like us to look at next, and share this video with someone who still believes that wars are won only with weapons and not with patience. We will see you in the next analysis.